coming up on Choppers Politics.
Politicians are professional politicians. They don't actually know anything, usually, about the stuff they're in charge of.
I'm Christopher Hope, the Chief Political Correspondent of the Daily Telegraph, and this is Choppers Politics. Now, I've not exactly seen the summer sun like last year, have we, listeners? But hopefully my selection of superb interviewees on this week's show will bring a bit of joy to your otherwise damp July. Later, I'll be catching up with Trade Minister Ranil Jayawardena to talk about upcoming trade deals with much sunnier territories like Australia and New Zealand. And he'll be telling me the benefits of the humble postcard. Plus, we'll hear how a bunch of bananas might have led to Brexit through the story of the metric martyrs. But first, the start of July saw the beginning of the end of the pandemic furlough scheme. Employers now have to contribute to the cost. But long before we ever knew what the term furlough meant, there was another wide-ranging welfare reform that had a big impact on millions of people. Universal credit. It was initially derided, much derided, but universal credit has become what can be seen as the unsung hero of the lockdown. So I caught up with its architect, David Freud, Lord Freud, the former Welfare Reform Minister. David Freud, welcome to Choppers Politics.
Good to be here, Chris.
Now, you've got a book out this month called Inside the Welfare Trap. You'll be known to our listeners as being the guy who came in and set up universal credit between 2010 and 2016. But of course, we're also working with Gordon Brown's government. UC has been the unsung hero, hasn't it, of the pandemic?
It's funny, when something works, no one notices it. When it goes wrong, everyone goes berserk. But yeah, it took a long time to get right. But universal credit, because it was digital, it was actually really well set up to handle this pandemic. In the spring, there was a 6-week period when 1.8 million people applied for universal credit, and it handled it. And the last time we had a crisis, which was in the financial crash in 2008, the system really more or less broke down when it was just 100,000 a month.
Just describe for listeners the kind of benefit system you discovered when you became the Welfare Reform Minister.
Yeah, well, one of the officials when I was going round originally said to me that if you had a vaguely complicated claim, your papers were lost 40% of the time. So it was not a functioning system. And it's basically a system that had been built up with a hodgepodge of different benefits, and they didn't work together, and it was very inefficient in terms of targeting money to the people who really needed it.
How many different benefits did universal credit replace?
In the end, it was only 6 of them, but they were the big 6. And the ones that were really complicated and why it was so difficult to do, it pulled in the tax credit system alongside the unemployment benefit system. So you had people who were on low pay as well as people who were on no pay. And then it also pulled in the key thing, which was your housing benefit. So the complexity of those 3 things really dealt with the people's fundamental needs.
And in terms of lessons you may have learned from universal credit, I do advise anyone to read your book. It's a great lessons learned book. There'll be lots of calls to reform Whitehall post the pandemic to make it more responsive to threat. Do you think we need more business people like yourself? You worked in the city, you're a former FT journalist before you joined the government. Do you think that your kind of expertise learned outside of Whitehall is what the civil service needs?
I think one of the problems, or the main problem with really big projects, is when you look at it, no one is really in charge. So, okay, I was the minister in charge, but I didn't set the pay and rations of the team. And in fact, the team turned over the whole time again and again. So if we want to get these projects right, we have to put someone in charge. But then we also have to make sure that they're politically answerable, because these are big political projects. So we have not managed to find a way of doing that in this country. Whereas in places like France or in the US, their constitutions work rather differently, so that it's much easier for them to do it.
I read that you had to put up with 6 different project managers, 6 chairmen or senior responsible owners during the construction of UC. Is that right?
It was quite horrific. Those figures are quite right. 6 senior responsible owners, the chairman figure, 6 project managers over the first 5 years. So the continuity was appalling. But even worse than that was the turnover of the staff within the project below those senior levels. Because what's happening in the civil service is that because there's been pay restraint for the best part of 25 years now, the only way they get more money is if they get a promotion and move jobs. So the good civil servants all seem to change jobs every 2 years or so, which means it's incredibly hard to get continuity. And that is in sharp contrast to experience in business, where your real objective in when you're doing a project is to build a team and keep it stable.
It strikes me that ministers or prime ministers have recognised that problem. I mean, that's why they have tended to leave ministers in place for long periods, Jeremy Hunt and others. I mean, I think that's understood at the top of government. I wonder whether the civil service gets it.
Funnily, I when I saw Cameron early on, before I was appointed, I said to him, look, our big problem is you move ministers, or prime ministers move ministers every, 9 months, 2 years or so. And I said to him, you can't even work out where the toilet is in that kind of period, let alone reform anything. You've got to leave people responsible. And I think he heard that, actually. And then, of course, I ended up being the longest serving minister in a big portfolio. I mean, I did it from 2010 to the end of 2016, longer than anyone else.
And you had to. And one of the lessons you learned in the book is that you need to choose only a few, what you describe as heartland projects, big projects, because the system can't take more than a few.
Yeah, what there is an immense scarcity in the economy of some of these really difficult jobs. If you want a data architect, which you need if you're building something, there are not very many in the economy. There are not very many project managers in the economy who are really good. And one of the things about those people is that they're very expensive because they have got huge skills and they are a rare breed. And that's the other thing the civil service finds it very hard, is to fit that kind of person into their pay scales.
Is that why you may be relaxed about the pay scales at HS2, for example, which are eye-watering and are the highest in Whitehall?
Yes, I think that's a good sign. That's a sign they're buying the people they must have, and those people are paid enormous amounts of money, eye-watering amounts of money in the context of the public sector.
And you think that there should be more business people hired to help run these projects?
Yeah, one of the ideas that I have actually in the book is employ the very best person to run a project and put them in charge of paying rations and building a team and everything else that you need to do to run a good project. But then you have to make them politically answerable, because these projects are at the heart of government and they have to stand up and say what they are doing on a regular basis. And I thought the one way to do that would be to appoint these people to be a particular minister to do this and put them in the House of Lords, where they would be regularly answerable to a very informed group of people who would quiz them mercilessly, but politely, unlike in the Commons, so that you get this expert, project management expert with a stable team who is also politically answerable. You could have the implementation minister quizzed weekly, daily on what he's doing in that forum, which you would not get with the Select Committee.
You were different to other ministers in the sense that you worked for both Labour and Conservative. How different was that?
Well, I mean, it was a different thing. I was the independent advisor for Labour. I started off under Blair, went through under Brown, although I don't think he knew I was being appointed by James Purnell, and he was pretty angry when he found out because he didn't like me. And I had a huge row with him at one stage.
Oh, really? Why?
Well, when I did my original piece of research, the independent report on what to do with welfare to work, he was very angry because it was being commissioned by Blair. So he wanted it to be his, and he wanted it delayed so it would come out, I think, under when he was going to be Prime Minister. So he when I went in to see him, we spent half an hour with him, quite bruising, trying to emasculate it, which I had to resist. This was all happening in semi-public, and it's a very good thing, I think, for one's career to be caught having a row with Gordon Brown.
And that helped you going into the Tory government. So you were an advisor for the Labour government, weren't you? And then you became a minister in the Tory government.
Yeah, that's right. I think I became, for a bit after I wrote that piece of that independent report, I became a bit of a symbol of radical welfare reform for a short period. And so all of the parties were kind of coming around and interested. I mean, what I didn't realise, I know a lot more about politics now than I did then, is that they just want your name. They don't really want you to do anything. They just want you on board so they can claim they've got a radical welfare policy. They don't actually want you to do anything. And what was interesting was later on, I actually got down and was able to do something, which is not something necessarily that people expected. Politics is a really, really odd, bizarre game. And I don't think I realized quite how odd and bizarre it was until I got into this particular world, which I did. After all, I was more or less 60 years old when this all started to happen. So I got into it very late. And it is very peculiar to watch the way that people behave and all the signalling that goes on. And much of what politicians do is about signalling and what they would like to happen and what they think should be happening, but probably isn't.
What's an example of that, David? You know, a lot of our listeners will be working in normal companies. They won't have experienced politicians. What's an example of this strange signalling you experience?
Well, you would say, I mean, I'll try and think of an example off the top of my head, but, Ian Duncan Smith, who was my boss for a lot of the time, was very good at this. He would say that something was actually happening when it was basically a gleam in our eye. The thing that you've got to remember is that politicians are professional politicians. They don't actually know anything usually about the stuff they're in charge of, which is why you have all of these weird interviews going on between journalists who often have been experts in an area for years and years and years, who know much more than the politician. And you have these weird standoffs in more or less every political interview that you listen to.
They're generalists who have to pick up a brief very quickly. I mean, occasionally I would argue that George Eustace, who was the Environment Secretary, whenever I've seen him talk to farmers, I'm in awe at his level of knowledge. I think there are some ministers who do know what they're talking about, but yes, that's a concern, isn't it?
Well, I mean, I think ministers do get into their brief if they're given the time. And I mean, a good example of that is Ian, my boss, Ian Duncan Smith, who actually, you could see in the first go-round when we first got in 2010, really didn't understand a lot of the welfare system because it's so complicated. But when he came in 2015, the next time, he really was on top of all the minutiae. I mean, I was lucky. I had started a few years earlier under the previous government to get in on top of some of those issues. So I had a good run at it. But that also is an advantage that most people don't have, 2 or 3 years to understand the issues before you get into government and then have to apply some of those things.
Do you think a similar cross-party approach might work for social care? That's the big issue facing this country over the next few months. I mean, there'll be some kind of bill or plans published before Christmas.
Yes, I mean, I always think that the best thing that we could do with really big, difficult issues is, as I say, decide on an implementation minister who is outside making politically answerable. But if you had a process of making, say, 3 really big, important projects, strategic projects, you could also look to have that agreed across the political spectrum so that there wasn't quite so much political noise and flack flying around over particular difficult issues that there is now.
So it could be you? Are you asking for a job here? They need someone senior from outside of Whitehall. It's a big issue. It's the last big challenge for David Freud.
Yeah, well, I think I must say one of the things I found was that the stress of doing these jobs is enormous. I got some stress-related illnesses, and I did pretty well because, I used to swim around the pond, cold water every morning, and I used to cycle into work, so I kept myself healthy. If I hadn't, I would have collapsed.
Well, David Freud, it's been great to have you on. The book is called Clashing Agendas, Inside the Welfare Trap. I do recommend it to any listeners who want to know more about how Whitehall really works. Thanks for joining us this week, David Freud.
Thank you, Chris.
and we'll put a link to David Freud's new book, Clashing Agendas Inside the Welfare Trap, in the show notes to this episode. Do give it a read, it's a great book. Now do stay with us. Coming up, we'll be talking trade deals, tariffs and Tim Tams with International Trade Minister Ranil Jayawardena right after this.
I'm Sophia Yan, the Telegraph's China correspondent. And in our latest documentary podcast, I take you inside a story of uprising, of dark twists and turns, and of a people's fight for freedom.
I forewarn those radicals not to attempt to violate this law because the consequences are very serious.
You never know who will report you, who will denounce you.
Such a beautiful and wonderful city being dismantled by this terrible regime just for their obsession on power, total control.
Our new series tells you how one law turned Hong Kong upside down. Over 4 episodes, you'll hear from the activists and politicians who fled their own country, the young people finding their own quiet ways to keep resisting, and the parents worried for their children's future. It's a tale that tells us as much about China as it does Hong Kong. Search Hong Kong Silenced wherever you're listening to this.
And we're back. Now, of course, this podcast was once called Chopper's Brexit Podcast, and there was a time when he couldn't move for talking about trade deals and Brexit, but during the pandemic, they took a bit of a backseat, and with very good reason. But that's starting to change, with announcements in the past few weeks about a new provisional tariff-free trade deal with Australia. But we are not there yet, and of course any resolution about the infamous so-called sausage wars concerning the Northern Ireland Protocol have been delayed for another 3 months. One man with his finger on the trade pulse is Ranil Jayawardena, MP for North East Hampshire and Minister for International Trade. Love that big chair Ranil's got, it's great, isn't it? It's like mastermind. I'm going to ask you some questions.
I've never been called that before.
I'm going to ask you questions now for a minute about trade.
You've started, so you shall finish.
Exactly. And just to warn you listeners, Ranil's impressive chair was in a rather echoey office, which you'll be able to hear during our chat. Ranil Jayawardena, welcome to Choppers Politics. Great to have you on.
Great to be with you.
Now, you're busy, aren't you, doing trade deals? How many so far?
Well, we've secured trade deals with 68 countries around the world, plus the EU, covering well over £700 billion worth of trade last year. But, the really exciting thing is there's more to come. This is just the beginning, and we've got an agreement in principle with Australia, but we're making good progress with New Zealand. We've announced our intent to join the CPTPP, and indeed announced our intent to begin negotiations with India too. So much done, much still to do.
So what can we expect this year? Is New Zealand this year and India next year, for example? And how about the US?
Well, we're making good progress with New Zealand. We've just closed another round of negotiations. But, we never set arbitrary timelines on these things because that doesn't serve the British national interest. We will ultimately only ever agree a deal when it's working for us. And I'm confident we can get there with New Zealand. On the US, we did secure some progress with our friends in the United States to support Scotch whisky, for example. And, we'll continue discussions with the United States. But I'm really excited by the prospect of CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because this is an area of fast growth. It's already 13% of the world's GDP, covering £9 trillion worth of GDP. But unlike the EU, it doesn't require us to pay a membership fee. It doesn't require us to cede control of our laws or our borders. And, as part of the sort of Indo-Pacific tilt, as part of the integrated review, CPTPP is where Britain's future lies.
I'm going to test you now. What does it stand for again?
The Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Now, critics say, why on earth are we trying to do a deal with Pacific countries when we've got a massive trading bloc on our doorstep that we've left?
Well, we can have both. That's a really exciting thing. We've got a trade deal with the EU. We've got real prospects to continue to have friendly relations with our near neighbours. We've just done a deal with Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein, the EEA countries, agreement in principle a couple of weeks ago, or about a month ago now. And we have got real prospects locally as well as globally. And, the opportunity to now secure an agreement with the Trans-Pacific Partnership and friends further afield shows we can do both.
You've done 68 deals so far, Ranil. How many more this year?
As I say, we're not going to put any numbers out there because we're going to make sure we get the right deal for Britain. But, the fact that we've got agreement in principle with Australia already, the fact that we're making good progress with New Zealand, kicking off the deal with CPTPP, the future is very bright.
These deals are all very well, Ranil and Jayawardena, but how are they benefiting people in this country? The Australian deal only cuts the price of a bottle of wine by 11p, which is important. Every little helps, but not a lot off a £6 bottle.
Well, this is going to be a great deal for the whole of the British economy, and people across Britain are going to benefit. It's the first deal we've negotiated from scratch. I think it really does demonstrate that we are capable of great things as a sovereign trading nation, and it liberalises our trade in so many different areas across all of the United Kingdom's exports, from cars and whiskey to ceramics. It's a great opportunity for every corner of this country, and it deepens access for services providers as well, creating new opportunities for the tech sector, and that's millions of jobs. Ultimately, as we build back better, as we come back from COVID, we need to make sure we are supporting jobs and creating new ones. And so this deal, which is the most advanced deal that Australia has agreed with any nation bar New Zealand, I think really does create a gold standard for digital trade and innovation, which is a real win-win.
So is that deal now the template for future deals, given you started it from scratch after we left the EU?
Well, it certainly shows what we are capable of and what we are up for. And it does pave the way for the Trans-Pacific Partnership because Australia is a key member of the CPTPP. But, I think some of the provisions are provisions that folks will look to and say, yeah, actually, there is real scope as we digitalise our trade, as we increase data flows around the world for us to do more in Britain's game.
Are we seeing things fall in value in shops yet? That was one of the big sells of the Brexit campaign in 2016, that the price of things in shops will fall.
Let's see what the retailers can do on that front. But ultimately, the opportunity is not just lower prices, but more choice. And the opportunity for shoppers to be able to choose from products all over the world rather than have this artificial tariff barrier set by the EU. I think that is an exciting prospect for people all over the world and for people here in Britain. So, we can export more of our Welsh lamb, our Scotch beef, the cars made, Nissan announcing a great investment in the Northeast. We can export our products all over the world, and in return, we can buy all sorts of great things from our friends too.
So we might see Australian Tim Tam biscuits at some point in our local shops here.
I'm told great things about them. I must confess I haven't tried one yet.
But the point is here, it's meant to open this country up to the world. That's the point of Brexit, and that's what you're trying to do, right?
Absolutely. There are some that said Brexit was about pulling up the drawbridge. I say it couldn't be further from the truth. Brexit and taking back control of our laws, our borders, our money, our trade policy is actually about going out there and building stronger relationships, deepening our friendships with folks around the world, some of whom we haven't been able to pursue greater trade with as a result of being in the EU. So the Australia deal is just one example of that. And by working with some of our like-minded friends, those people who have a shared belief in democracy, free trade, high standards, I think we'll be able to address some of the global challenges together, tackling unfair trading practices, combating climate change. I think these are things that we need to work with our friends on, and with Australia, with New Zealand, with Canada, I think there's a great opportunity to do more.
What do you say to farmers who attack the Australian deal amid fears of cheap Australian beef coming to this country? I mean, isn't it basically a labelling issue, essentially? What the future should be, if you want to buy Australian beef, you can. It costs less, but maybe it's not so well brought up as British beef or less quality. Is not this all this big debate about how you label stuff and let the consumer decide?
Well, you're right, labelling is really important, and I know that the Department for the Environment is looking at that closely. And in respect of consumer choice, you're absolutely right, consumers need the right information to be able to act accordingly. I know that a lot of supermarkets, as a result of consumer demand, for example, pulled out of products where it was derived from palm oil from illegally deforested areas. And that was consumers being able to demonstrate that they had real choice and they were exercising it. They were voting with their feet, so to speak. But in respect of Australia and the opportunities I would contend for farmers, the price of beef in Japan, in Korea, is twice what it is in the United Kingdom. So the opportunity actually for our farmers to sell to Asia, I think, is an opportunity we really must seize. Only 1 in 5 food producers actually exports today. I think we can massively grow that and improve our economy, particularly our rural economy, for the future. And in return, if consumers, perhaps in restaurants or wherever, want to be able to have the novelty of an Australian steak, then so be it.
So what's your message here to the NFU? Do you think they're protecting their market rather than looking at the bigger market maybe outside this country?
I'm sure we can work with the NFU and farmers across Britain to identify these new markets around the world and seize them. But also, if you look at lamb imports from Australia, for example, to the United Kingdom, the cost of lamb is already 25% higher than British lamb. So the idea that there will be unfair competition it isn't correct. But what we must do is help the industry take up the opportunities globally.
In terms of Brexit, how is it going?
Well, we took back control of our laws, our borders and our money as we promised. Call me old-fashioned, but politicians delivering on their promises, that's got to be a good thing. We said that we'd do a trade deal with the EU, and we have. And whilst, there have been, let's be blunt, some disagreements, I hope we've demonstrated that we can overcome them. And that is what good friends, near neighbours would want to do.
You mentioned earlier the deal in Nissan, which will create thousands of jobs, a new battery plant and a new model. Do you know how much the UK government put into this deal?
I'm not well cited on this. Department for Business looks at that.
There were concerns that Nissan could pull out of this country after Brexit. Well, the reverse is happening.
Well, I don't think, actually, that the scare stories, the Project Fear from those on the Remain campaign have been borne out. And there's a reason for that, is because Britain is actually a really strong economy. It's a great country. It's a supermarket, and it's got great labour force. And that means as a place for international investors to place their cash, to devise their future business plans, we're a great place to come. And with Nissan, for example, the Australia trade deal actually helps them because the opportunity to export from Britain to Australia is an opportunity that our automotive industry has already identified as one that they will be seizing. We're very pleased that we've been able to do that through our trade policy. It shows that ultimately trade policy can enable businesses to make their own decisions and prioritise investment in countries like ours, countries like Britain, that are going to be forward-leaning.
You've also talked about unethically grown soya and hinted at a ban on soya, which is grown in illegally deforested land. And that was planned maybe in the run-up to COP in November. Is that going to happen?
Well, so the Department of the Environment is looking very closely at how we can make our food chain and our supply chains more sustainable. I know that the forest risk consultation was devised to make sure that we were empowering business to make smart decisions, to make sure that where there was illegal deforestation, the United Kingdom, our economy, our people, our businesses were not contributing to it. Of course, there's always more that we can do, and we raise these issues with counterparts all over the world. I spoke with my Brazilian counterpart earlier this week and raised this very point. We are, of course, committing a huge amount of money to international climate finance. We've spent well over £100 million in Brazil, for example, to help create more sustainable farming practices, which is protecting something like 46,000 hectares of land now. And, that's just the start of a 10. There's more that we can do. And COP26 is going to be a very important moment for Britain and for the world to make sure that we are more sustainable in the years ahead.
But this ban would require companies can't source any soya if there's a forest risk, i.e. a risk to the Amazon. It sounds like quite a clever idea. It might be enforced before November.
Well, I know that the Department of the Environment is looking very closely at this. And, I think consumers have already demonstrated what they think in this area. And when it came to palm oil, they voted with their feet. And I'm sure that consumer power will act again.
Sounds like quite a strong hint there, but I'll leave that for listeners to decide. And just finally, Ranil Jayawardena, we're approaching Freedom Day, July 19th. I think it looks like we are going to be out by then, finally, and restrictions are lifted. How will you be spending your first few hours as a free person?
well, I think I'll be here in the office working on trade deals. But I look forward to catching up with friends. And I know my children are looking forward to being able to have that freedom over the summer holidays to do things that haven't been possible over the last, 18 months. The children, I think, are the ones that really need this freedom. So I look forward to spending some of the summer with them.
But you'll be travelling, of course, with your passport. And when you go away on your trips around the world, do you always bring back a present for the children? I always try to when I was going away.
Sometimes I bring back a present, but I'm very old-fashioned. I always try and send a postcard to them, which always arrives after I have landed back in the country, of course. But I'm trying to. I've always tried to send them a little message about where I've been and what I've done and what I've seen, and hopefully in the years ahead they'll look back at that and go, yeah, there was some merit in what my daddy was doing.
The idea of a postcard seems so quaint and so old-fashioned.
There's nothing wrong with traditional sending of a postcard.
Great to have you on. Ranil Jayawardena, thank you for joining us this week on Choppers Politics, and best of luck with these trade deals. We need them.
Thanks, Chris.
Right, I'm going to ask you a question, listeners. When do you think the seeds of Brexit were first sown? Was it here?
My friends, it is a stitch-up. It is the biggest stitch-up since the Bayeux Tapestry.
Or here?
Take back control that the £350 million a year that we give to the European Union is spent on our priorities.
Or even here?
Give the British people a referendum with a very simple in or out choice.
Well, I'd argue that the first proper rumbles of Euroscepticism started in a market in Sunderland. 20 years ago, Steve Thoburn, a greengrocer from Sunderland, was raided by the police. The officers seized 3 sets of scales from his market stall, used normally for weighing bananas. His crime? Using scales which failed to show metric units and instead displayed imperial measurements. Thoburn was later convicted under new EU laws which had just been adopted in the UK. He had become the first of the so-called metric martyrs. Steve Thoburn is sadly no longer with us, so I started with a trip to Sunderland to speak to his daughter, Georgia, about her dad and his case. Hi, Georgia.
Hi, Chris.
How are you doing?
Fine, how's yourself?
Yeah, long journey up.
I can imagine.
Yeah, but we're here. This is where the metric martyrs battle started.
It did. It all started here. Do you want to come in and have a look?
Yes, please. Thank you. So you've got some cuttings out of the files of the campaign.
Yeah, we have. There's lots here.
So it was Sunderland Echo, and then it kind of exploded into a national story.
It did, yeah.
War on scales of injustice, and there's the same picture of your dad there with his scales, which were at the heart of the whole thing. And there's your dad on the front page of the Telegraph in January 2001, accused of selling bananas by the pound. Prosecution brought to protect the public.
It's crazy to think he was convicted because he wanted to give his customers what they wanted. They didn't come in and ask for a kilo of bananas, they wanted a pound of bananas. Nobody ever knew what a kilo was around Sunderland. I don't know about the rest of the country, but it was everyone, his customers were always pounds and ounces, never kilos.
He wasn't doing it for a reason to be difficult.
He wasn't doing it for him, he wasn't, no.
Britain voted to leave the European Union in 2016. Is this unfinished business?
It is, yeah. I feel like it's the final push. We've come out of the EU. Now I think we're really ready for it all just to be finalised. It just needs to be finished with. It's been going on far too long, and my dad doesn't really need that conviction against his name, does he?
And there we have, finally, saved. Britain can keep the pound, pint, gallon and the mile. And I do think, that your dad started this. Metric martyr who died fighting Brussels. That's your dad, and that's totally amazing.
It's amazing to think my dad was the one that really did. He's pushed it, and then obviously everyone since has all continued it, and we're just going to make sure that he does get his pardon.
Neil Heron, who was a friend of Thoburn, has campaigned for 2 decades for the martyr's convictions to be overturned. He was with Steve the day after his stall was raided.
There'd been an undercover consumer protection exercise gone on, and someone had come in and bought 34 pence worth of bananas, and Steve had actually weighed them on imperial scales, so he was effectively being done for selling bananas by the pound. And he was visited by 2 trading standards officers, accompanied by 2 police officers who threatened to arrest him if he didn't hand over his scales.
In 2000, the British government adopted an EU directive into UK law, which meant that traders must display metric units or face criminal charges. Steve Thoburn became the first of 5 to be prosecuted under these new rules, which caused many, for the first time, to question the influence of Brussels in Britain. Can you draw a line from the metric martyrs cases to the decision to leave the European Union in 2016?
Yes, I mean, this was the first time that the British public was able to touch and feel something that had come from the EU, that had emanated from the EU. For Steve, his face was recognised everywhere. He was the face of the campaign. Coming down to the High Court in London, he would get into a taxi drivers wouldn't take any money off him. First time we went into the Royal Courts of Justice on the Strand, the security guards clapped, gave him a round of applause as he came in. So this was an ordinary working class man of the people who was fighting up for everybody. And this was us against the system, us against bureaucracy, and it was a fight that was always going to be won in the hearts of the people.
Steve and Neil attempted to appeal the case all the way up to the European Court of Human Rights. However, they failed to overturn their conviction. And then, in 2004, tragedy struck.
We sat in Steve's van shortly after receiving the decision, and we reflected on it and said to Steve, well, it's up to you. What do you want to do? He says, I'm just going to continue serving my customers the way they need to be served. He says, will you make sure that you continue the fight? He's quite reflective. And then 2 days later, Steve died. He had a massive heart attack Sunday morning. I got the phone call on the Sunday morning, and by the time I got to the house, he'd been taken away in the ambulance, and he was pronounced dead. And it was a massive shock to the family, to his customers, and to the British public as well, because this was a person who stood up to fight the system, representing everyone out there, and all that's left now is the pardon to clear his name.
Well, Neil, should we go and see what the traders in the Granger Market in Newcastle think about Steve Thoburn and his fight for the right to sell an imperial?
Absolutely.
Well, what are you selling in here? I can see. Well, you do it in bags. Is that how you get around not using pounds and ounces?
No, we still use, we bag stuff up, but on the inside we've got pounds. See, pounds
there, yes.
Pounds. And we've got kilos on as well.
But the kilos are very small and yes. The pounds are bigger. That's breaking the rules, Bobby.
It's not breaking the rules. That's not breaking.
Tell me why it's not.
As long as that's wrote on a ticket, it's not breaking any rules.
Is that right?
That's right.
Do you know Steve?
I knew Steve very well. I know Neil very well as well. We worked in the same market for years. Stress. That's how he died. That's my opinion. Because he was a lovely kid. Lovely kid, up the crack of dawn every morning, always there, always had a smile on his face. And always had the time of day for everybody. You know what I mean? And the stress that he went through with that was disgraceful.
And do you think he deserves a pardon then?
100%.
Pound of bananas?
You want a pound of bananas?
Yep, that is.
Right.
Yep, that's fine, I'll do.
1 pence and them.
There we are. A pound of bananas in memory of Steve Thoburn. Rest in peace. In 2001, just months after Steve Thoburn was prosecuted, a second metric martyr emerged. Colin Hunt worked as a market trader in Hackney and, just like Steve, he failed to display metric measurements on his scales. Hackney Council decided to prosecute him under 6 counts of the Price Market Order 1999 for using solely imperial measurements.
Yeah, in the beginning, we had all our scales converted to kilos, great expense, and then we priced big tickets in kilos, but the customers, majority of them are old West Indian or Chinese or whatever, and all the old people couldn't understand it. So what we did was we changed it around. We've done the tickets, big display in pounds, but also smaller underneath in kilos.
So the crime, Colin, was the fact you were ticketing in pounds and ounces.
Yes.
And then converting it into kilos.
Yes.
For the law.
Yes.
But the customer wanted it in pounds and ounces.
Because they could not understand it. They could not understand.
So your crime was literally doing what your customers wanted to do.
Exactly.
2 others were to be targeted by the authorities in that year. Campaigners launched legal battles against each conviction and lost every time. However, no other prosecutions went ahead for market traders refusing to use metric scales. It seemed the campaigners had won the battle for public opinion. And then
we had Hackney Council market inspectors came up to my store and just confiscated my scales.
Even though you had some grams and kilograms and
yes.
8 years after Colin Hunt was raided by the police, Hackney Council decided to prosecute another trader in Ridley Road Market called Janet Devers.
They took the imperial and they left me the kilos.
And the key moment, Janet, was when you asked to be tried by a jury.
Yes.
And that was the moment the council said, right, we're going to end this prosecution.
Yes, they did. And we was in Snaresbrook Crown Court, and when I asked the judge to be tried by a jury, Hackney Council backed down.
Is that because they were worried about what public opinion might say?
Yes, of course, because everybody was behind me at the time. I mean, letters and donations and everything. And as soon as I said that, the barristers were all talking together, and then the trial finished.
Although Janet managed to get 4 charges against her dropped, Hackney Council successfully prosecuted her under 8 charges of the Weights and Measures Act 1985. The EU directive, adopted at the turn of the century, had created yet another metric martyr. And Brexit happened in 2016. Did you vote to leave or remain?
Leave.
Leave.
Of course.
I'm not surprised.
I'm so happy, you know, I wish it happened 20 odd years ago, but I think the country's going to be better. We've got our own rules, regulation. We don't have to be dictated by what we can sell, what we can't do. You can't sell this, you can't do that, you can't weigh this. I think in the future it's going to be a better country, I really do.
So there you have it. Now, some see the case of the metric martyrs as the beginning, a small beginning, but the beginning of Brexit. It was at least a classic example of a little guy versus the establishment. But to this day, they remain convicted criminals. Maybe now the UK has left the European Union, it's time, surely, that they are given the justice they've been waiting for so long. What a story. I'd love to hear what you think about the metric martyrs. Please do email me, chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk, or find us on Twitter, we're at Choppers Podcast. Thanks to my guests, David Freud, Lord Freud, Ranil Jayawardena, and everyone who very kindly joined me to talk about the metric martyrs, particularly Neil Heron, who has fought that lonely cause for over 20 years. Thank you to my producers this week, Louisa Wells, Elliot Lampitt and Theo Ludis, and Stephen Edgington, who produced the item on the metric martyrs. But most of all, thank you to you for listening. If you enjoyed this show, please do give us a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other people find this show. And if you're not a Telegraph subscriber already, please do sign up. Go to telegraph.co.uk/chopper to get your first month completely free of charge. And finally, do buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph if you can. You won't regret it. Until next time though, cheerio!